Hey everyone, today we're going to learn how to make a completely procedural geometry node setup that is going to give us air bubbles or normal bubbles for our scene. It's going to be pretty easy to set up. I'm going to explain everything in full detail for our beginners, and this video is going to be broken up into a few parts. The first is using geometry nodes to make our bubble, then we'll move into plugging our group input nodes in for a custom panel in the modifiers tab, then we'll make some materials for our object, and we'll finish off with some live viewport compositing. For this tutorial, you're going to need at least Blender 3.1 as that's what I made our geometry nodes on. If you want to be extra special, you can do Blender 3.4 Alpha because it has the live compositing option. Starting off, to get the best shading in our scene, I'm going to hit A and then delete everything. Then I'll add in a cube and hit Control 3 to make this a subdivided cube. Next, I'm going to hit N, go over screencast keys, and click on the box because I always forget to enable it. Now I'm going to right click and hit Shade Smooth on our object just to give us an object to start with. To make a new geometry nodes tree, I'll click on geometry nodes and this little new button over here, and then I'll apply our subdivision so our mesh is ready to be manipulated. The cool thing about geometry nodes is you can plug literally anything into your geometry nodes, like a cube, and no matter what the original mesh is, it will always appear as what you plugged into. So for example, I can make a monkey here. If I move it over to the side and then give it the same modifiers like this, it's also going to be a cube. Unfortunately for the cube today, we're not going to use a cube. Instead, we're going to use an icosphere. So let's delete this cube. If you've made it already, we'll hit Shift A, S, and then look up icosphere. I'm going to add the icosphere into our group output so we view an icosphere like this. Icospheres are pretty good to start off for bubbles because they don't have a lot of geometry, but we can manipulate it so they look like bubbles. To give it a little more geometry, I'll hit Shift A, S, and we'll add in a subdivision surface node. I'm going to bump the levels up to 2, and to make it nice and smooth, I'll hit Shift A, Set, Shade, Smooth. Boom. So now we have an icosphere that's subdivided and smoothed out. I'm going to highlight all of these, hit S, Y, 0 to make sure they're on the same plane, and then move them over here. It's always good to save your projects, so I will save mine as well. Now this is pretty good if you just want your air bubbles to be perfectly round. In my personal opinion, I like my air bubbles with a little curve, so that's what we're going to do. To add some curve, some displacement onto your node here, we're going to hit Shift A, S, and search up for a set position node. This helps us manipulate our object in all sorts of ways. I'm going to hit Shift A, S, and make a noise texture. After that, I'll plug the factor here into the offset, and boom, look at that. We have some noisy, some curvy air bubbles. I want a little more control over this mesh, specifically the ability to control how impactful the noise is to the mesh, and also the ability to control the position of the mesh because it looks like it's a little offset here. To do that, I'm going to sever the connection of the noise texture in the set position, first by making sure I have Node Wrangler enabled on the add-ons, and second by holding Control and then my right click and then dragging across here to sever the connection. We're going to be doing that a lot. I first want to start with a vector math. We'll plug that into our position, and then we'll plug our noise texture factor into one of the vectors here. It doesn't really matter. We're going to add our noise texture with the original position or the current position of the object like this. That way the noise affects the object or the position of the vertices in the object, and it gives it some displacement like this. To control how powerful the noise texture is affecting our object here, we can duplicate our vector math node, and I'm going to change this to multiply. Now, the more that we multiply, it's going to affect it more powerfully. It's especially seen if we scale up our noise texture like this. You can see it has lots of bumps and lots of ridges now. So I don't have to drag across all of these. I'm going to hit Shift A, S, and then add in a value node. And what this is going to do is just let us change one thing instead of 3 things over here in the vector. For my scale, I like to leave it around 1, and then we'll mess with the value a little just to get a oddly shaped bubble like this. Now this is a little off center, and this is because Blender likes to do something really funny when we displace our geometry in geometry nodes. It does that for every one value that we put in through our noise texture manipulating our position of the vertices. It applies an offset of 0.5. So if we put negative 0.5 in to even it out, it should look like that. The problem is if we don't have a value of 1 it's going to be crazy trying to figure out the math to do that. Luckily, we can manipulate our geometry nodes so it always figures it out perfectly. I'm going to highlight all of these nodes and move it up to make some space, and I'm going to add another multiply node and plug the vector right into the offset. From here, I'm going to use the bottom vector, drag up with my mouse and hit -0.5, and then I'll plug in the value that we're using to manipulate the strength of our noise texture into the multiply here. So whatever value is being plugged into our noise texture through our multiply node, it's also going to be applied through -0.5 here, and it's going to go up into our offset. So that means it's going to stay centered no matter what value we plug in. Again, I like my bubbles with a little curve to them, so something like this should suffice. With our bubbles having been created, let's highlight all of our bubble nodes here. We'll hit Shift P to make a new frame. I'm going to hit N to go into our node side panel here. I'm going to give it some color and then name it air bubbles. Let's take our whole frame. I'm going to hit G to move it down, and to go back to our original mesh, I'll sever the connection by holding Control, right click, and cutting through this mesh. Now let's take the geometry and connect it back up to our group input to see our original mesh again. Now we want our air bubbles scattered all around our mesh. To do that, we're going to scatter it only on the surface and then scale it down a few times to make it look like it's scattered on the inside of our mesh too. If you don't understand that right away, that's okay. We're going to do it here. The most common way to scatter object is by hitting Shift A, S, and we'll make it distribute points on faces node, put it right here. That's going to change our mesh into a bunch of points that we can manipulate the density of to apply on our object. We'll make another node here called instance on points, and that's going to make it so we can plug anything we want into the points here and it's going to show up. So let's take our geometry, we'll plug it into the instance connection here. Our bubbles look a little too big, so we'll scale it down using the icosphere, and they look a little flat and not curvy at all. So again, we're going to manipulate our noise texture here, give them a little curviness, and maybe scale down the value and mess around again with our noise texture and value just until we get something that we want. There we go. Something like this. To randomize the rotation and scaling of our air bubbles, I'm going to drag these nodes over here, hit Shift A, S, and make a random value node. I'll plug that value into the rotation. I'll hit Shift E, Y, and then make another one for the scale. For the random value for the rotation, we can do 0 to 360. That means they'll be rotated in every way randomly possible. And for our random value scale, I like to move everything up to 1 just to see how big our air bubbles are going to be. I think this is a little too big, so I'm going to go over here to the icosphere and then make them a little smaller like this. Then we'll go back to our random value for the scale and make it so our smaller bubbles are at a reasonable size like this. So now we have randomly rotated, randomly scaled, big, small bubbles that are throughout our whole surface of the mesh. Air bubbles aren't just on the surface of the mesh though, they're also on the inside of the mesh. So that's what's next. To wrap up our apply bubbles on points setup here, we're going to highlight all of our nodes, hit Shift P to create a frame again. We'll add some color to the frame and call it apply bubbles on points. You can also add in scale and rotate if you want to be specific. I'm going to move our air bubbles down here, and I'm going to sever the connection of our output and our initial input here and drag our original nodes, not delete them, and drag our original nodes all the way at the top for a fresh start. In order to scatter our bubbles throughout the whole volume of the mesh, we're going to make 3 meshes, one being slightly smaller than the original, another being a little more smaller, and then the third one being the smallest, and then applying the bubbles on that mesh. That way it looks like it's spread out through the whole mesh. To do that, we're going to scale this object here. Now the easy way to do that is hit Shift A and then add in a scale node, like scale elements, and then you can adjust the scale to make it bigger or smaller. We actually want to scale by normals though, because although it works for a simple object like this, if you have a complex object that you want to put air bubbles in, it may not work as well, and the bubbles may start to leave the mesh. That's what I found from my experience. So instead what I'm going to do is hit Shift A, S, and then we'll add in a set position node here. The set position node is going to be offset by a vector math, and we'll change it to scale like this. Now it doesn't know its scale, so if you change the vector like this, it's still going to change the position, and if you manipulate the scale, it simply won't do anything. So we need to tell the scale node what it's scaling by. What is the vector? What is it reading off? We'll do that to scale on normals by making a normal and plugging the normal right into the vector. That way, when we adjust the scale, it scales along the normals. The interesting thing about this node is 0 is the original scale, 1 is a lot bigger, and if you scale negative, it doesn't actually invert the mesh until you hit -1. So if you want the original size, we're going to move it to 0 here. Our normal, scale, and set position nodes are actually really useful, and if we want to make multiple meshes, we're going to need to use this node setup a few more times. So let's highlight everything, and instead of pressing Shift P, hold Control and hit G to make a new node group. Think of a node group kind of like a custom node that you can have other nodes inside of. We want one of the inputs for this node to obviously be our initial geometry, but the other one's going to be our scale. That way we don't have to go into the node every time we want to manipulate it. And if we hit Tab to leave this, you can see that we have our own custom node here that scales along our normals, just like this. We can rename this node by going over here. If you don't have this panel, press N on your keyboard. N as in Ngon, it should pop up, and we'll make this label here, scale along normals. So we have our scale along normals node, which does exactly what it says. It scales along the normals of our object. Now to visualize what we've done, we'll take our scale along normals and plug it into our distribute points on faces for the mesh, and then we'll take the output here of the instances and plug it onto the geometry. So now what we've done is made our air bubbles able to be manipulated by this custom node that we made to have a bigger or smaller area. Now if we make a join geometry node, and look at our original mesh at the same time by shift right clicking, dragging across this connection, and then dragging it all the way over to the join geometry. Again, you can shift right click here and then move it up for a little extra node organization. Our air bubbles are again on the outside of the mesh. I'm going to hit Z and go to wireframe here, prove that they're all still on the surface of the mesh. To change this, I'm going to adjust the scale along normals to move our air bubbles to the inside. This only works because we have our initial geometry still running into the join geometry, but our initial geometry is being manipulated by the scale along normals. It's running through our nodes that we have here, and then our bubbles are popping out on the other side. So if I get rid of this one, the bubbles disappear. If I get rid of this one, the original geometry disappears. So think of our bubbles like our scaled down geometry, just a little manipulated here. I'm going to connect this back up again, and to add bubbles all throughout our mesh, take your scale along normals, duplicate it a few times like this. We're going to take that join geometry node and move it over here. We'll join all of our geometry, and it needs something to reference. So let's take our geometry output here and plug everything into the scale along normals. Now, all of our air bubbles are still close to the outside of our mesh, so we'll take our second one and scale it down a little, move it closer to the inside, and then we'll take the last one, scale it all the way down almost, so everything is close to the inside. Now if we go into our mesh, we have air bubbles all around our object like this. This is really the setup that we want, and that concludes using geometry nodes to make air bubbles in our mesh. If we go into rendered view though, it looks like a normal sphere because we didn't apply any materials. So let's set up our geometry nodes so we can easily apply materials and adjust our settings from the modifiers tab over here. Just like we can make a custom node, we can also make a custom modifier tab for our geometry nodes by plugging in inputs of certain nodes into the group input of our geometry node input here. So I'm going to take the scale of all of our scale along normal nodes and I'll plug them into here. Then something else that we might want to change in the future is the density of our points. So I'm going to drag the density into here. I'm going to highlight all of these nodes, hit Shift P, again hit N, give it some color, and then call this guy scale along normals just for some organization purposes. Now to add some materials to our object here, I'll go down to our air bubbles because we want to change the material of our air bubbles as well as our object. Hit Shift A, S, set material. I'll plug it in here. Take the red output, that's where we would apply the material, and plug it into the group input. I'll do the same thing over here. Shift A, S, set material. And again, this line is going to be connected up to the join geometry as our original material. So I'm going to drag this guy also in here. Now let's name everything. Again, hit N as in Ngons if this panel doesn't pop up, and go to group. Now we can adjust the first scale as our outside scale. You'll notice it pops up in the modifiers tab too. This means it's the bubbles closest to the outside of our mesh like this. The next one we're going to name middle scale because it's close to the middle of our object, and last one is the inside scale because it's really close to the inside. So again, we have our outside bubbles, our outside scale, the middle scale, and then the inside scale. So our bubbles are scattered all throughout our object here. And our materials, the first one we did is our bubbles. So we'll call this guy bubble material, and then we'll call the next one object material. Now we have the option to apply any material we want in our modifiers tab under a geometry nodes modifier, which I think is pretty cool. Before we do that, I think density is one of the most important operations we can have. So we'll click on density and click the up arrow until we are just under geometry. That's going to move the density up to the top in our modifiers tab too. Now we'll move into making the materials. So let's go to the materials panel here. I'm going to add 2 materials and I'm going to click new on each. This one's going to be our object material. This one's going to be the bubble material. We'll go back to our object material. If you wanted a material like mine, it's really easy to simulate glass using the principle of BSDF. By doing this, we're going to turn our roughness all the way down so we can see through our object, and then our transmission all the way up so it appears as clear. Now we'll hit Z and go into rendered mode, and you can see that it's still a sphere because we didn't apply it in our geometry nodes. To apply it, go back to the modifiers tab. We'll set the object material to object material, and then bubble material to our bubble material. Now we can see our bubbles inside of our object. Not really bubbles yet though, because they're not clear as well. Remember, air bubbles are just trapped air inside of some ice or whatever substance you're looking for. So we'll go back to our materials tab here and change our bubble material almost to the same thing. Turn that roughness all the way down, transmission all the way up, except this time we're going to change our object material to have an IOR of 1.5 because that's the traditional refraction of glass. Refraction just meaning how much a object or material bends light. So if the IOR is 1, then we see through it like we're looking through a vacuum, and if it's 1.5, then it bends the light a little, and you'll see that in the bubbles. Moving on to some rendering and some compositing now. Let's go back to the layout tab. We'll go into rendered mode here, and don't forget that our geometry nodes is a modifier. So what we can do is even make a cube if you want. I'll move this cube to the side, and then I'll shift click on the object with the modifiers, hit Control L, and then go to copy modifiers, and look, our cube has the exact same thing going on too, with air bubbles scattered throughout. And the cool thing is, now that we set up everything in our modifiers tab, is that I can manipulate our geometry nodes in here in the modifiers tab, and it's not going to affect our sphere whatsoever. So I can change the density, I can change all of the scales of the object, and nothing happens to our sphere. I'm going to delete the cube though, and we'll stick to the sphere today. For the lighting, I had my cursor set to the middle by Shift S and cursor to world origin, and then I hit Shift A and made a area light. I rotated the area light to 90 degrees like this and moved it over to the side, scaled it up a little, and I turned up the wattage, the power of the light. I did the same thing on the other side, except I rotated it, duplicated it, and made another one over here like this. Now if we go to the front view of the sphere, we have a pretty convincing sphere with air bubbles in it that, don't forget, can be manipulated completely procedurally and changed. If you want something similar to the setup in my scene now, I'm going to hit Shift A, make a camera, and then I'll hit Control Alt 0 to move the camera to my position. What I like to do is kind of zero everything out here in the location and then back up on the y-axis just to make sure it's centered on our sphere. You don't have to do it, but I hit Control B to make a border around the camera so it's only focused on what is rendered in scene. For example, if the same object was out of the camera, it wouldn't be able to see it here. Now we're going to move into live compositing. Again, you must have Blender 3.4 alpha at the current time, or Blender 3.4 in general, in order to use the live compositor. To enable the live compositor, make sure you're in rendered mode, click this little arrow, and then go to compositor. I'm going to drag this box up like this and then go into the compositor from here. Now I have a pretty simple denoise setup here. To make the most out of my denoising node, I'm going to go over to this tab, internal my denoising data, and then connect up to normal and albedo. That way it does a better job at denoising, especially with a scene where we have lots of light bounces through some reflective and some transparent, translucent materials like this. Now I'll hit Shift A and then add in in a alpha overnode. I'll go right here, and it initially appears white, but if you put it on the second image slot here, that makes it so our current image applies over the color in the background now. And you can change this color obviously to be whatever you want. I'm going to change mine to red, and if you want your sphere to be the same color as your background, this step is really important. Go to the Render Properties tab, scroll all the way down to Film. First, make sure that you have transparent film checked, and second, make sure that you have transparent glass checked. This is going to make it so our glass is transparent when it interacts with the compositor in our scene. As an example, it may appear that this world around us is red, but if we turn off the live compositing and then turn off the transparent here, our world is actually gray around us. So our cube and all of the lighting is going to interact with a gray surface. If that's how you want it, that's okay. But if you want to achieve the same effect, make sure that we have transparent world and then transparent glass also checked. That way Blender recognizes that it can see through the glass and it applies an alpha behind the glass instead of just showing what would be the world. So we'll go back into the live compositor here. No! Again, I am in Blender 3.4 alpha, so there is bound to be some crashes. Oh god, it brought me all the way back here. Okay. Let me do it again. Why is it like this? I can see myself. Okay, we're back. Again, final thing to remember, under film, click transparent glass, you should be good to go. Now for the final export, you can adjust your settings however you want. Again, in our modifiers tab, you can adjust the density of the bubbles, how many bubbles there are, the outside scale. Something I did in my renders, I even brought all of my bubbles here to the outside, and it gave my mesh a cool bubble effect like that. I'm uploading this on my Via Crescendo YouTube channel instead of the Blender YouTube channel because Via Crescendo is about all of my art, not just my photography, not just Blender, not just my martial arts, all of my art, everything. Plus these Blender tutorials usually do well, and I want to get a lot of views for this new channel so I can get monetized. So it would mean a lot if you would subscribe and like this video. And now you know a little about geometry nodes and a lot about how to make air bubbles in Blender. Last thing you have to do is hit F12 to render, and you should have a awesome air bubble render like this.